Hey fearsome friends, it's nearly the month of Halloween, and I've got my channel artist designing some limited edition merch, so keep your eyes peeled. And now to today's episode. From horny veterans to seeing a doppelganger and murder, here are 15 scary stories from Reddit. So sit back, relax, and get cozy, comfy, warm, because it's time to let your nightmares in. It was the year 2000, and the summer between junior high and high school for my class. Being idiot preteens in a fairly small town on the steep foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains, I was sneaking out of the house to meet at a playground, and it was my friend Heather and I's idea of a good time. We agreed to meet between 12:30 and 1 a.m. at an elementary school down the street from my house one night in July. We planned to jump the fence and head to the play equipment at the back of the campus so we could goof off without worrying about being seen from the street. There was something off about the night, however, and when we realized my combat boots were too big to fit properly into the chain link, we decided to skip over to a park closer to Heather's house. It would have been easy to shimmy my way up, but we both took the initial failure as a sign we should go somewhere else. 2 days later, police were swarming the elementary school. The bodies of 2 unidentified teenage boys were found near the playground, beaten, bloody, and unrecognizable. Authorities established a timeline before the boys were identified, and initially reports were made that they'd been murdered the night before. In fact, they'd been murdered the same night Heather and I had been trying to jump the fence. Forensics estimated the time of death was sometime between 12:30 and 1:30 a.m. Later that month, the boys were identified as our friends, Chris and Blaine. Blaine had been my grade school sweetheart. We were both deeply disturbed that we'd very nearly been at the scene when the murders were taking place. If we'd have been there any earlier or later, if I'd been wearing different shoes, what would have happened? Maybe our presence would have stopped it. Maybe we would have been murdered too. One thing was made clear, though, by the only suspect they ever caught. If he talked, he died too. Heather and I were too terrified to tell the cops we had been there. We were 12 and 13, and convinced we would be targeted if we spoke up. I don't know if I would do it differently now, but I don't think I would. I believe alerting the cops to our having been there wouldn't have solved anything further. But I wonder if I just say that to feel better about keeping my mouth shut. I still deal with a strange level of survivor's guilt, even though I didn't actually survive anything. If we hadn't listened to that gut instinct, telling us something would go wrong if we stayed at Valley View, who knows? This experience left a major impression on me. When I was a kid, I used to ride my bike around our hilly neighbourhood, sometimes with friends, sometimes alone. But on this particular afternoon, I was alone. I was probably 8 or 9 years old at the time, and was coasting down one of the big long hills. I used to let my jacket fly out behind me like a cape. Good times. Suddenly I was aware of a car driving on my left side and was slowing down. I'm not sure why I slowed to a stop. Perhaps the driver motioned as if they had a question. But of course I'd had stranger danger training, so I was cautious and kept my distance from the car, one foot on the pedal poised to go. It looked as if only one person was in the car, but I worried that someone else could be crouched down on the passenger side, waiting to jump out and grab me. Then the passenger window rolled down, and the driver, a woman with big hair, leaned toward me and called out, "Hey there, do you want to go to the circus with me?" I was immediately terrified. "No," I yelled, and took off down the hill, pedaling as fast as I could. The problem was that the bottom of the hill was just a court, and it was basically the end of our neighbourhood, bordering a major highway. I would have to turn around and come back up the hill on this road, which looped back up from the court. This was a steep hill, and I feared I'd be a sitting duck for anyone to jump out of a car and grab me. I started strategizing. Should I go off-road into a yard? My friend's house is back where the car was. I didn't even look over my shoulder to see if the car was following me. I just pedaled like my life depended on it, and my heart was pounding like it did. I decided grass would slow me down more, so I stayed on the road until I got to my best friend's house. It was probably the longest 10-minute bike ride ever, and I ran straight into the house like a wild child and told them all about what was happening. Funny, this was supposed to be a safe neighbourhood, and no one locked their doors during the day. I don't think anyone called the police, but I never saw that car or its driver again. But from that point on, I became hypervigilant and wary of putting myself in bad situations, even if all a bad situation meant was riding down that big hill with the court at the bottom. I avoided it. Even to this day, when I'm on a walk or jog, I make sure there are multiple escape routes on my path. As an adult, I've told this story to others who have been horrified, but the experience confirmed all the stranger danger warnings I'd received. I even thought it was normal. Recently, I looked up the statistics, and apparently it is actually rare for children to be kidnapped off the street by a rando. Maybe the craziest part of this story is that as a younger child, my one reoccurring nightmare was of a circus on fire. I was already scared of the circus, and a stranger tried to lure me into their car with it. I was walking down the main city road, carrying with me my backpack and jug of water with no place to stay. I'm broke, and I needed to figure out a way to buy a bus ticket, when this super old guy pulled up, stopping traffic in the process, and asked me, "Hey, do you cut grass? You look like you could use some cash." "Sure," I said. And why not, I thought. This wasn't the first time somebody had pulled up asking if I needed work, and the dude was like 90 years old, so I could see him needing someone to do this for him. Apparently the last guy had died, or so he said. So I hopped in and off we went, with not much conversation. I asked how big the lawn was, and if he had a push mower or a riding mower, that kind of stuff. On the way to his house, he said he'd pay me $100. Wow, I thought. This must be some lawn that needs cutting. We drove clear to the other side of the city from north to south, when he asked, "You drink beer? What's your favourite kind?" Nah, I don't drink much," I replied. "I used to drink Bush, not the light stuff. I'm not on a diet or anything." For some reason, I was getting some creepy vibes now, and we finally arrived at his place. It was a nice little neighbourhood, actually, with nice clean front lawns, but his, however, was tiny. It would literally take me 5 minutes. I set my stuff on the porch and he walked in through the front door. I followed and noticed a notary sign, so he's an old veteran who also happens to be a notary. Cool, but whatever. I followed him into the kitchen and he proceeded to grab a couple of beers out of the fridge. He got one for me, even though I said I didn't drink anymore. And while he was doing that, he said, "Have a seat." I sat at the table, and the first thing I noticed was a camcorder device sitting there and pointing right at me. He also deliberately set his veteran hat on the table, parallel and facing me, so I could see it. That's what it looked like he'd done anyway. He was sitting across from me, then pulled out a $100 bill, slid it across the table, looked at me and said, "Well, I'm gay, and I want to suck you off," all nonchalantly, like he was just stating the sky was blue. I was pissed and told him that I wasn't gay and wasn't doing anything like that. He dragged my ass all across town, having me think that I was going to mow his grass after I told him I was broke and needed a bus pass. A colossal waste of time. He grabbed the $100 bill back and asked, "Where do you want me to drop you off?" I wanted to just take the $100 and leave, but I didn't. I just stood up and walked out. If something like this happens again, I'll be sure to record the whole thing. This just happened to me a few hours ago. So this happened when I was in 4th grade and she was in 6th, and we rode different buses because I was still in elementary school and she was in middle at the time. Sometimes my bus beat hers and vice versa, but on this particular day, my bus made it home first. I let myself in and immediately hopped onto our one desktop computer that was in the dining room, and I was only able to enjoy it for all of 5 minutes before she arrived. The second she came inside, she pushed me off the chair and we started to play fight. Winner gets the computer. We always did this, every day. So in my version, after play fighting, she got up and ran to the kitchen. There's a door to the kitchen and combined living room that's always open and isn't even 2 feet away from the computer, where she stuck her tongue out at me and said, "You can't get me." We were giggling like crazy, and I reached out to grab her shirt, but I missed. She then took off down the hallway to the bedrooms and bathrooms, our room being at the very end. And at the end of the hallway she paused again and said, "Come and get me," and ran into our bedroom. I got to our room and it was pitch black, and my sister, despite being older, was scared of the dark. So I paused, feeling anxious, and was wondering if I should just run back to the computer. I stepped into the room though. I just knew she was in our closet. I felt it in every part of me. Regardless, I avoided it and walked into the opposite direction of the closet. I then bent down to look under the bed, and whilst there, the closet door started to slowly open. "I'm in here, come and get me." The bad feeling I was getting was now amplified, and my sister is the most fearful person of the dark, still is more than 17 years later. She would never hide in a dark room, let alone go into a dark, small closet. I took off running down the hallway, and to my horror, she was on the computer just staring at me, looking terrified. In her version, she jumped off me and ran into the kitchen, hid behind a trash can and watched me. She too had a bad feeling, but just saw me giggling and talking to myself and reaching out to grasp nothing, which was when I tried to grab her shirt. She was too afraid to come check on me, which is so my sister, and I still remember this day vividly. We were both afraid to sleep in our room forever, and even now that I've grown up, when I go to visit my dad, I still get those chills whenever I go past that bedroom. I'll stand at the door, but I never ever go inside. So I've never opened up to anyone about most of this. I'm a 22-year-old guy. I live with my best friend, and a couple of years back, we took a psychedelic drug called 2CB. I'm pretty familiar with psychedelics, including 2CB, and we took a high dose of about 30 milligrams. Then we took 40 milligram more once we were coming down. And I kept seeing my friend pulling faces at me in the corner of my eye, until I turned and faced him, and he wasn't. This went on for ages, and it was definitely sinister. I thought he was a demon, possibly the devil, and I felt like he wanted something from me spiritually. It was like he was going to drain me. After I came down, I was still so scared, and I didn't really get very close to him for about 3 months afterwards. I became okay eventually though, When I was younger, I would very occasionally smoke weed and love it. But now if I smoke it, I feel an incredible sensation all over my body that I can't describe. It's like an aggressive vibration that moves around me, and I also feel like I can see it sometimes. It's like static, but no one else around me sees it. I stupidly continued to smoke, because I thought it was something dark that I could maybe get rid of, but it never goes no matter how long I wait in between or where I am, and I feel like it's possibly something from a different dimension. Now I know I sound batshit crazy right now, but how can I get physical sensations if it isn't real? I felt it move my hand and even grip my arm before. Moving on, and I'm completely off drugs now due to me realizing it could possibly be psychosis, as my great aunt was schizophrenic, and my girlfriend and I would be lying beside each other, when I'd feel a great energy, like it was coming out of my chest and into her back. Then I'd put my hand on my chest and it would stop. It's like I was being drained of something. Also, the past few nights as I was lying in bed with my girlfriend in the dark, so my vision wasn't great, I swore I saw her mouthing words of some sort at me, almost like she was saying a spell. Again it felt sinister, and then I saw her pulling scary faces. I asked if she was okay, and she said yeah, and seemed confused. I don't know what's going on, but any advice would be greatly appreciated. This occurred when I was in middle school and living in a nice suburb of Dallas. I was probably only 11 or 12 at the time. I'm 22 now, and had gone to one of my friends' houses to spend the night, along with a couple of other girls. We decided to go out and TP one of my friend's crush's house, as middle schoolers typically did for fun years ago, and it was late when we headed out. The sun had long since set, and the cool evening air was a blessing in the Texas summer. We arrived at the house, quickly getting to work, slinging toilet paper up through the tree branches and hushing each other as we laughed quietly. With the front lawn covered in a dozen or so rolls of toilet paper, we decided to head back to my friend's house for the night. The street we were on was beside the elementary and middle school and was illuminated with street lamps. It wasn't as dark on this particular street, and without a single car in sight, we talked and giggled to each other about pointless nonsense on the way back. Eventually, we heard the hum of an engine break through the crickets chirping, and I turned to see a small black car driving slowly towards us. Oddly, their headlights were out, and as we passed by another street lamp, the driver's face lit up slightly. I could tell that the driver was an adult male, relatively thin and dressed in dark clothing, but nothing else really stood out. Turning back to my friends, we'd all noticed the car at this point, but still kept pace back to her house. All the while, the car kept creeping even closer. Why hadn't the driver just passed us already? Why was he purposely driving so slow? The car eventually pulled up right next to us, coming to a screeching stop. The man suddenly got out of the car and took a few long strides towards us, arm outstretched. My friend at the front of the group absolutely took off, and we all followed suit, running after her. We heard the door slam shut as the man hurriedly got back into his car, slamming on the gas to try to catch up to us again. Now more than slightly panicked, like what the actual hell was this guy going to do to us, we ditched the sidewalk and sprinted into the field between the two schools. We heard tires screech behind us, and I spared a quick glance over my shoulder to see the man had stopped in the road again and was now merely standing by his open door, staring directly at us. Without a road for him to follow, we ran through the field, then cutting into the tree line on the far side and dashing through one of my neighbour's yards I knew didn't have a fence. We made it back to my friend's house shortly after, it not being too far from that point. Her mum questioned us as we entered, wondering why we were all out of breath and so shaken up. My friend quickly told a white lie, not wanting to let on to whatever had just happened. I think back to this experience every once in a while as the years pass. I had originally calmed myself by reasoning that the man was probably just the boy's father, the owner of the house we had teepeed that was intent on lecturing us for making a mess of his yard or something. The only problem was, I had met his dad at a back-to-school event a few weeks later, and the large bearded man looked nothing like the man driving the car that tried to follow us. My friends didn't want to talk about what happened that night, and I suppose they were just as sketched out as I was. I then wondered about his intentions. Did he mean to grab one of us? We were a group of 4 scrawny young girls, all alone in the street at night. It was a terrifying thought that a complete stranger might have tried something like that in my small town, in my own damn neighbourhood. For reference, I lived a mere 2-minute drive from the schools, so this hit a little too close to home. My town had a good reputation, where nothing bad ever happened to the residents. The people there lived in blissful comfort, with knowledge that our town was safe, a bubble in everyone's mind. But this experience broke that illusion for me. I'm extremely thankful nothing bad happened, that we ran through the field to get back, and that he didn't try to pursue on foot. Needless to say, we never went out to toilet paper another person's yard after that. And as for the man driving the car that scared the crap out of a bunch of young girls, I hope I never see him again. Now, what I'm about to tell you goes back a couple of generations, at least to my maternal grandfather and grandmother. It would go back further, but I don't know, as my parental side has never had anything like this happen. I also don't know if you'll believe any of this, because I have a lot of stories, but I'd like to share it with you anyway. Now, my grandfather used to play a game with my mother. It was with cards, but not like you'd think. They would go back and forth, asking the other what card they were holding. Then they go back and forth again, going lightning fast, getting them all completely right. But there was a feeling like a pressure in their heads. And when the pressure was gone, they wouldn't be able to do it anymore. They could sense that whatever it was gone, until the next time when it would come back. However, it was my grandmother that had the really crazy stuff happen. Seeing and hearing and experiencing things that no one else did, though I don't know any specifics. My mum had gotten scared of a movie when she was a kid, and she asked my grandmother, "Nothing like that can really happen, right?" referring to the movie, to which my grandmother responded, very seriously. She said, "There's good and evil in the world." And that always kind of sent chills up my spine, because that isn't a typical thing you'd say to a kid. So my mum got a mix of what both my grandmother and grandfather had. There's a lot of stories she had, but one that stuck out to me was the one and only time she played with a Ouija board. She and my father were never married, but had me when they were still dating. And while they were dating, my father was a relentless cheat. My mother and a friend of hers decided to play with a Ouija board one night. This was before I was born. And the friend walked out of the room to get the drinks, and my mum asked the board if my father was cheating on her. She was young then, and had her suspicions and didn't know for sure. Now mind you, my mother was alone in the room, and the planchette that the spirits are supposed to move to spell out words started to go from the sun to the moon repeatedly, going faster and faster each time, until my mum got too scared and let go of it. She never played with one again, and I don't think either she or her friend said goodbye. The following stories I'll post will be my personal experiences, some of which do involve my mother, and a story or two from my husband, because he's a magnet for things like this too. Go figure we found each other, right? I'm fairly sure our son also has these abilities, or whatever you want to call them, to some extent. It's hard to tell for sure, because he's only 2, but he's been known to look over people's shoulders, including my mother's, and talk to someone or something we couldn't even see. When I was a young girl around 8 years old in the late 80s, I would often play at a school park by myself. There was a lawn bowls area there, and sometimes the players would let kids help them and give them a bit of change in return. One guy seemed really nice, and often gave me a £1 rather than the 20p that most did, and he would talk about his own kids and his pets. Now I knew about stranger danger, but this guy was no longer a stranger. I knew his name, and he was my friend. We had spoken to each other every weekend for the whole summer. As the nights drew in, I stayed closer to home, and along the road was a petrol station with a shop. One evening I had gone to buy some milk for my parents, and in the window there was a picture for sale. I loved it as it was a dragon, and I love dragons. When from behind me I heard a nice guy say, "Hi there, that's a nice picture. I have one just like it. You can have it if you want." I was so excited. "It's in my car by the park," he said. "Why don't you come and get it?" Now I wasn't allowed near the park when it was night time, and I had to take the milk home. He said that was fine and he would wait in the back alley behind my house for me instead. This was when I started to feel creeped out. I went home and told my dad and older brother what was going on, and they both leapt up and ran out the door, whilst my mum phoned the police. I never saw the nice guy again, and I was always with an older sibling or one of my parents when I went to the park or shop after that. This is probably the closest I've been to being robbed, or what I assume was going to end much, much worse. It happened about 4 years ago on Christmas Day. I had spent the morning at my mother's house, and then got in the car with my on and off again boyfriend at the time, as he was going to drop me off at the train station, so I could catch my train at 10 p.m. I had done this a few dozen times, because I used to go to school across the Canadian border, and would travel alone as a 19-year-old girl quite often. I'm pretty tough, and extremely outspoken, so not the person you typically want to pick on for nefarious reasons. Although my ex was not very tough in stature, and was often seen as an easy target. So here we are, sitting in the car outside of the train station, smoking my last bit of pot. I was a fairly reckless teen, but also always aware of the bad that could happen, when a man walked right up to the car and tapped on the window. He was rough-looking to say the least, and I assumed was approaching his 50s. My ex carelessly rolled down the window all the way and asked him what he needed. The man explained that his car had run out of gas, and he was in need of some help because he had no phone or money. He also said his wife was in the car and was pregnant, and they just needed to get home. Now, living in the big city, you get used to people asking you for money, but that's not what concerned me. When I really started to panic was after I had already given him all the cash I had on me, which I think was around $20, and he then got really weird. He really wanted us to get out of the car and come help him. My first thought was, how the hell do you think we're going to be able to help you? So I sternly spoke up and said that we'd given him some money and he should now leave. He then acted offended that I would even be scared in this situation. He just kept insisting that we go over to his car where his wife was waiting, but it was clear in my thoughts that under no circumstances would I be walking over to his car. Now I was starting to get angry, as he started to spew off some crap about him being a war veteran and for us to not worry. He started saying some random-ass numbers as if they would matter to us at all. Then he proceeded to grab my ex's wrist and explain to him how he could break it in one move. At this point I said something to the effect of, "Leave us alone right now." Then he looked at me and stepped away. I told my ex to move the car to the other side of the station so we could call the cops, and nothing else really happened. I got on the train fine, and the cops never got back to us. But the more I think about that night, the more I get freaked out about what he'd really intended to achieve. So to the creepily aggressive man who ruined my Christmas, I'm never going to get into your goddamn car. This happened in 2016, when I was in my sophomore year of college. I lived in a campus dormitory, but I usually spent the weekends with my family back home. I would go home after my last class on Fridays, which ended at 5 p.m, and on average I got home at 9 p.m, as the ride from my college to my house is around 3 to 4 hours, depending on traffic. My commute consists of a bus, train or jeepney, and a tricycle ride, and whenever I go home I bring a backpack and a small suitcase filled with my laptop, school stuff and some clothes. So one Friday, it was raining cats and dogs all day. We have the most intense storms ever, and some areas of the campus were slightly flooded. I hesitated about going home that day, because I worried that I might get stuck in traffic. Also, I'd be greeted by swarms of people, and/or lots of floods, which would make my commute 10 times harder. Regardless, I still went, and boy was I dumb for doing so. I was right. Our bus was stranded for 6.5 hours on the expressway, 4.5 hours more than my usual bus ride, and before we reached the train station, I asked the kind lady beside me on the bus if I could borrow her phone to text my mum to update her about my situation, as my phone had been stolen weeks before this incident. She kindly did, and my mum immediately replied that she doesn't want me to come home alone, and that I should wait for her in the station, as I probably won't be able to catch a train ride, as its last trip was at 11 p.m. I met up with my mum around 11:30, and since the train station was already closed, we would have to take a jeepney instead. But every jeepney that passed us was already full, so Mum and I decided to walk further, hoping to find and hail another one. She dragged my suitcase, and I wore my backpack on my chest, holding my golden brother with one hand, and linked the other to my mum's arm. The crowd slowly began to thin out, until we realized that we were already alone on a dimly lit street. We walked so fast that the groups of commuters in front of us that had become 50, then became 10, then 2, until we couldn't see anyone around anymore. We were no longer surrounded by bright establishments, but quiet and dark houses, and most of the street lights were broken, the only light being from passing cars' headlights. It was around 12 a.m. by now, and we were still walking almost in the center of the street, as the sidewalk was full of parked motors, tricycles and pedicabs. I was closer to the few passing cars, when my mum said, "Be careful with your umbrella, it could be..." Just then a topless man pushing a dirty ice cream cart appeared out of nowhere behind us. He stopped walking, stood up beside me, looked straight at me with his bloodshot eyes, and whispered something angrily and incoherently. All I understood from him was, "You thought I was going to... gold umbrella." We supposed that the guy thought that we were referring to him possibly snatching my umbrella. Side note. In the Philippines, it's normal for men to be topless due to our weather, but it's not normal to be topless when it was so cold and drizzling. It's also normal for vendors to sell ice cream, even when it's raining and cold, but it's not normal, it's crazy, to be pushing an empty ice cream cart at almost 1 a.m. The only feasible reasons for this are that the guy was as high as Mount Everest, or he had stolen the ice cream cart in the middle of the night. He briskly walked past us, then he was gone, and we thought that that was the end of it, but my heart continued to beat rapidly, and I just knew something was wrong. I asked my mum to give me my suitcase and hold my umbrella this time, and I put my backpack on my back and carried the suitcase since dragging it was just slowing us down. However, as soon as I looked up, the man was standing about 12 meters away from us, and 2 seconds later he ran towards us fast, whilst screaming like a banshee, pushing and intending to hit us with his ice cream cart. Fortunately, there were no cars around, so Mum said to cross the street and run forward. We figured that he couldn't easily maneuver and turn the cart around, so we kept running forward. My mum said that we shouldn't show him even a little bit of fear. "Don't scream, just keep running," she said. And we ran even faster when we heard the sound of the cart's wooden wheels meeting the pavement, and were getting louder and louder as the man ran after us, while still screaming, laughing, cussing and mocking us. We didn't want to risk and turn around to look at the man, so we just kept running and running until we found a well-lit gas station and hid behind a huge white van that was parked up. We peeked through the van's window and saw that the man was still looking for us. He didn't dare to come near the gas station, and instead stayed on the dark street. Thank God for an empty jeepney that pulled in after a while. We made our way over to it as quietly as possible, and when we got inside, we immediately collapsed on the seats and ducked down quickly when we saw the man, still looking for any signs of us. We took our first breath of relief when the jeepney started moving and being filled with passengers. Where were you all when we needed you the most? I thought. Mum and I discussed the incident the entire 2-hour ride home, and we considered reporting it to the police. But we didn't in the end, as we didn't even know where we were. Plus, I only saw a glimpse of the man's face when he looked me in the eyes. All I know is that he has short hair, a thin physique, a dark skin tone, was wearing only black shorts and slippers, and was pushing an empty yellow, dirty ice cream cart. I was young, maybe 12 to 14 years old at the time, and I had several friends who lived in the neighbourhood behind mine. I was a latchkey kid, so I would often walk there by myself and walk home by myself, and it was maybe 10 minutes or so. One day I was walking to a particular friend's house to spend the night, so I had my backpack with me. I had made it past the clearing of the small wooded path that I take from my neighbourhood to hers, when I noticed a large white van, the stereotypical stranger danger one, and when I walked by it, I noticed 2 men were inside. Something about their faces made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I continued walking, trying to glance every now and again to see if the van had started moving. Much to my dismay, it did. It was very slow, as this was a residential area after all, and I immediately started running. I turned a corner quickly and luckily made it to my friend's house, losing them at the last minute. I was huffing and puffing, especially as a child with asthma, and so my friend's dad asked what had happened. I told him and he went outside to see the van was gone. He told me I watched too many horror movies and that I was probably overreacting. A couple of days later, I was yet again going to sleep at this friend's house, so I had my backpack. This was the early 2000s, so I didn't have a cell phone yet, but I cleared the same path and noticed the same men in the same van, and immediately they locked their eyes with me. I pretty quickly realized I was in danger if they had ill intent. They've seen me. They know which street I'm walking to, and they are close enough to me that if I turn around, they could catch me on foot. I booked it, and I have never run my little asthmatic ass so fast before. To my horror, the van accelerated and was following me right up until I reached the street, at which point the man in the passenger seat flung the door open and started chasing me on foot. He was overweight, so I knew my best chance was to outrun him. I threw my backpack, hoping it would either hit him or trip him up, and luckily he stumbled over it, long enough to stall him a bit. I finally made it to my friend's house, and her dad called the police. They retrieved my backpack, but the men were gone, and unfortunately I hadn't gotten a license plate. I didn't see them or hear anything about it again, until a few weeks later, when we received a letter in the mail from the town police department, alerting my parents that one of the registered sex offenders who had moved in years ago was arrested again for attempting to kidnap another child on that same street. He was the one driving. The second man was a new accomplice. They had attached a photo of both men, and even their eyes on paper made my blood run cold. This happened more than a year ago, and during that time, my girlfriend and I, both 22, were illegally renting an apartment in Amsterdam for 5 months. The incident took place in January, during the last month of our stay, and it's genuinely one of the scariest things that has ever happened to me. It was around 1 a.m. and my girlfriend and I were in bed. She was fast asleep already, but I was still scrolling through Instagram, when suddenly our doorbell rang. Now, to give you an idea of where we were located in our apartment complex, we were on the 2nd floor of the building, and there were 2 apartments on each floor. When you walked up the stairs, there was one apartment on the left and one on the right, and across from us was our neighbour, though we hadn't really seen much during our stay. When we did see him, he always came off as a bit weird, and some evenings he would be very drunk. My girlfriend and I are a lesbian couple, and when he found this out was when we moved in, and he asked some weird and offensive questions. Our downstairs neighbours had seemed okay, but we hadn't talked much to either of them. 1 floor above us were the storage rooms, one for every person in our apartment complex. Some weren't in use though, and the doors were unlocked, which always seemed weird to me and my girlfriend. There was also a doorbell system downstairs at the main entrance, and everyone had their own personal doorbell. The one that rang during this night, though, was ours. My girlfriend jolted awake with the harsh buzzing sound booming through our apartment, and I was immediately on edge. She was mostly annoyed and wanted to go right back to sleep, but the person downstairs kept ringing the doorbell, and I got more and more unnerved. I was wondering who in their right mind would keep someone awake like this, and in order to answer the downstairs doorbell system, there was a phone in our apartment across from the front door, and part of me wanted to pick it up and find out what was going on, but my girlfriend convinced me to wait. We then faintly heard the doorbell ring in our downstairs neighbour's apartment as well, before ours went off again. The walls in our building were very thin, and the apartments were in bad shape overall, so we could hear the doorbell quite well. Suddenly I got scared that something was really wrong. Maybe there was a fire. Did we really want to be the ones burning alive because we were too stubborn to pick up the phone? I asked my girlfriend if I could just find out who was at the front of our door, and she agreed. So I got out of bed in nothing but my underwear, something I would later come to regret, and walked to the phone. I picked it up. Hello? It was a man, and he told me in a weird mixture of Dutch and English that he was worried about a friend of his that lived in our building. He said his friend had been very drunk earlier in the evening, and that he wasn't answering his phone anymore, so he wanted to come inside to check on his friend. Now, before you judge my next actions, here are some arguments to defend myself. First, I immediately thought of our weird neighbour across the hall, so it didn't seem too far-fetched he was the drunk friend that this man was worried about. And secondly, despite the motto, be weird, be rude, stay alive, I still suddenly felt very awkward in denying this man entrance while he expressed concern for his friend. So even though I didn't know him or couldn't see him, and despite his story being kind of weird and his speech hard to understand at times, I pressed the button that unlocked the front door downstairs. The moment I did this, my gut feeling that something seemed off was confirmed. The man started laughing really loudly and yelled, "Ciao!" into the speaker. The sound of his manic laughter was so loud that even my girlfriend, who was sitting upright in the bed, could hear it. Immediately the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and we looked at each other terrified. I knew this was all wrong, While I heard his footsteps running up the stairs, I checked to see if our front door was locked, and it wasn't. While cursing myself, I retrieved the keys from my coat pocket and turned them in the lock. Meanwhile, I could still hear this man's footsteps running up the stairs. Now, because of my panic to lock the door as fast as possible, my hands were shaking like crazy. I was praying to myself, "Please, not our front door. Please, not our front door." But as soon as I had locked it, the man was at the top of the second staircase. He ran up to our front door and pounded on it as I stumbled back into our living room. "Open the door, you whore!" he shouted. The door rattled in its hinges, and I almost soiled myself. I wanted to get back to my girlfriend, but in order to do that, I would have to walk past the front door. I wish I was dressed in more than just my underwear, as I felt so vulnerable in that moment. I took a deep breath and just made a run for it, ran past the front door and past the peephole that would allow me to see out, but I was too scared to get that close to the maniac of the only thing that kept me safe. My girlfriend was hiding under our sheets, frozen in fear, so I crawled into bed with her and whispered, "We have to call the police. We have to." She was shaking her head though. "No, we can't make a sound. He has to think we aren't home." Meanwhile, we could hear the guy taking a few steps back and running up to our door, throwing himself at it. Sometimes he would be silent for a few seconds before the pounding started again, and he also kept demanding that we open the door. I expected the door to break open at any second, and honestly thought he was going to kill us. My girlfriend and I held on to each other, and were just frozen in fear. We had no weapons and didn't want to make any noise, fearing he would hear us through the thin walls. Suddenly it got very quiet. With trembling hands, I picked up the phone from our nightstand and called the police. It was now around 1:45 a.m. They luckily took us very seriously and immediately sent a patrol car over. They said that the police who were coming would call us, then they hung up and we waited. Minutes went by. Not wanting to be alone, we decided to call my dad, and luckily for us, he was still awake. He was very spooked by our situation, when all of a sudden, whilst talking to him, we heard footsteps in the main hall again, but very quiet ones this time, like someone was sneaking around. "Oh my God, Dad, I think he's still here," I cried. My dad called the police from his place, and they informed him that it was them making their rounds through our apartment complex. Kind of annoyed they had accidentally spooked us like that, I thanked my dad for checking. The policeman left without really speaking to us, but they did tell my dad on the phone that everything had been checked and that they couldn't find anyone. Kind of relieved, we hung up, but my dad had drunk one beer too many to be able to pick us up. I could tell he felt bad about that. But afterwards, my girlfriend and I tried to relax, knowing we wouldn't be able to sleep. We kept thinking he would come back, and every noise startled us. I also started wondering if maybe he was hiding in one of the storage rooms upstairs. So after an hour, we gave up and called my girlfriend's mom, in hopes she'd be awake. And she was, so she drove half an hour to come pick us up. We made sure there was someone staying over at our place during the next few nights after that, which helped us feel more safe. But needless to say, we were very happy to almost be moving out of that apartment. Luckily for us, the strange man never came back, but we never found out what his reason for entering was either. Was he on drugs? Drunk? Was he having psychosis? I couldn't help but wonder, what if I had looked through the peephole at whoever was on the other side of the door? Would I have recognized him then? Or would I recognize him later in someone who passed me on the street? I guess I'll never know, and to this day it was still the scariest thing to ever happen to me and my girlfriend. I'm a 25-year-old female and was living alone in an apartment complex. The city I live in is pretty safe and with a low crime rate, but being a night owl, I'm often awake into the early hours of the morning. On this particular night it was 12 to 1 a.m. and I was getting some house cleaning done. I went down to take the trash out to the community dumpster, and like a lot of community dumpsters, it had a sort of wall that encompassed it, and just as I was approaching it and about to throw my trash bag in, to my surprise, a man suddenly stepped out from behind the wall and said something unintelligible whilst staring at me. This man was most likely homeless, as he was looking rough. He was super lanky, probably in his 40s to 50s, and I just remember he had these huge, wide, crazy eyes. He had that look where you can't differentiate whether they are mentally ill, high as hell, or both. Now, being the polite person that I am, I tried to play it off like I hadn't just been startled by this creepy dude looking directly at me, and I said something like, "Oh, hello. Have a good night." Looking back, I wish I wouldn't have made eye contact, or said anything at all, but I quickly threw the trash in and got the hell out of there and back to my apartment without looking back. I was on the 3rd floor of this apartment building, and I was basically triple hurdling up these steps. The stairs had gaps between them, so you could see down below. And as I was on the 3rd floor, I glanced down and noticed Dumpster Dude was beginning to climb the first flight of stairs. I went inside my apartment, locked the doors and turned off all the lights, hoping he wasn't following me. A couple of minutes passed, and I began to think that maybe I was just overreacting, and this guy lived there or something. But then I heard the knocks at the door, as well as him calling out, over and over. I looked through the peephole and there was Dumpster Dude, grabbing the doorknob and knocking repeatedly. Between his loud calls he would also mutter more unintelligible things, but it was very clear that this man was downright insane. At this point I was unsure whether or not to call the cops, or wait it out, as I hate dealing with the cops. So like any normal person, I jumped onto Discord to discuss what was happening with my gamer friends. They immediately advised me that I should call the police, so I did. I'm glad too, because the knocking and calling lasted for a solid 10 minutes. By the time the police arrived, Dumpster Dude had left my door, but they found him around the area. Apparently, according to the police, they were familiar with the guy who was in fact homeless, and said he struggled with social appropriateness. Yeah, you think? They said that he shouldn't bother me again, and thankfully he didn't. Ultimately, I feel bad for the guy. I mean, he probably doesn't have family or friends to help him, and he clearly needs it. But even now, 4 years later, I still can't throw out the trash without first checking who might be lurking behind those dumpster walls. Approximately 6 years ago, my grandma had an occipital lobe stroke and about 6 months later a cerebral hemorrhage. It was touch and go for a while, but she ultimately pulled through. However, due to the brain damage, she ended up with cognitive impairment, aka dementia, so it was a no-brainer that my wife and I would move in with her and take care of her, as my grandma and I were very, very close. Fast forward to winter of 2018-2019, when my cousin had come for a visit. Before bed one night, we were chatting with my grandma, and then cousin went upstairs to bed. I noticed that grandma was restless and fidgety, like she was up to something. So that night I checked on her a few times, and that's when I found her in the dining room looking for something, and this is where I need to describe the house. It's small and was built in 1929. Grandma and Grandpa bought it sometime between 1962 and 63, and the previous owners had built an addition onto the kitchen so they could be able to go into the basement without walking outside. This extension is what we've always referred to as the dining room. Now back to the story, and I asked Grandma what she was looking for, but she didn't really know. So I got her tucked back into bed and retreated to my room to do the same. She was still fidgeting though, and I saw she had her purse under her pillow, which isn't abnormal for her condition, so I didn't think anything of it. Around midnight 1 a.m, I woke up hearing a noise, and our dog heard it too, because he'd perked his head and ears, but he didn't bark, so I didn't think anything of it. However, just a few moments later, as I was going back off to sleep, I heard this voice in the back of my head tell me that I better go check on Grandma, because if I didn't, I was going to find her raped and dead in the yard. I thought to myself that I was being ridiculous and was a bit crazy, but I couldn't shake the feeling, so I got up to go check on her. She was gone. I ran downstairs and outside to the front and backyards, but nothing. I did the same a second time, and that's when I went into the basement, and I saw the back door was unlocked. I quickly got dressed and started searching the yards more thoroughly, but nothing. The gates were latched, so there was no evidence she'd left the yard, but she must have. I started shouting out for her as my wife called the police. Then I drove around a couple of blocks and kept expanding my search area. Finally, I saw a flashlight blinking at me in the distance, so I drove right over there. It was a woman, trying to explain that she'd seen Grandma. I drove further down the road and past this woman, when I finally spotted Grandma sitting on a cement wall, chatting with this woman's husband. I got her in the car, and when we got home, the cops were there. It turned out that Grandma had thankfully dressed for the weather. She had a knit cap on, strapped her purse across her chest, took her medication with her, and used a golf umbrella as a walking stick. She'd left because she thought my cousin was lost and was only 5 years old. And the only reason that woman and her husband were outside looking for Grandma was because the woman just happened to be in her kitchen and looked out the window, where she saw Grandma and thought it was out of place. So she woke up her husband, but Grandma was gone. But instead of just brushing it off, they went to look for her. I hate to think about what would have happened if I had ignored the voice and that woman had never gone into her kitchen or brushed it off. Always listen to your amygdala. It's never wrong. This happened about a year and a half ago at a park where I lived at the time, and it was an area where you were either really close to everyone or a loner. To start off, I like to walk to clear my head. There's a corner store in walking distance that I grab coffee at every night I can, and I sit and read my books at a park bench. It doesn't get dark early where I live, so I can stay out for a while if I still want sunlight. And I don't live far from the park that I walk to. It's probably about 5 minutes away. The first time I saw him was with my friend. I asked her if she wanted to meet up at the park and catch up, and she said yes, so we headed down. We parked ourselves on a bench in the grass, and it was around the golden hour. I specifically remember her silhouette against the sun and wishing I'd brought my camera. We both noticed that he had short dark hair, and he was a bigger guy, but pretty short. We saw him walking up with a plastic bag full of tapes. He handed them off to a taller blonde guy, when the tall guy said, "Could you be any less subtle?" The short guy said nothing, but I remember very vividly seeing he had a very unsettling wide smile. They then walked in the direction they'd come. I saw him the next couple of days doing the same thing with different people, handing a plastic bag over with tapes. There was only one time I saw the whole process though. I was just walking from the corner store when I saw him putting the tapes into the bag and tying it. A guy walked up to him, handed him a thick envelope full of cash, took the bag and left the guy with the wide smile. He then stood there counting the money for a couple of minutes before walking away. The last time I saw him, before I stopped walking to the park at night, was around a week after the other encounter. I was drinking my coffee and reading Silence of the Lambs in the dark, using my phone flashlight to see, when this guy plopped his sorry ass in the seat across from me and smiled. I didn't look up for more than 10 seconds. We both said nothing. About 5 minutes passed and it was getting late. My phone was dying too, so I got up to leave, when he began to follow me. Now there's a fairly busy road before I reach my neighborhood, and nothing like this has ever happened to me before, so I started to panic. There were cars going pretty fast, so to simplify my very logical thought process at the time, I sprinted across the road to try and get away from him. Thank the forces out there that it worked, as I'm not a fast runner, and I had a backpack on with my work and books in. With my thoughts racing and me continuously looking back, I probably would have been better off just walking. I vividly remember seeing his smile one last time in the streetlights reflecting off his teeth. Later on, and the corner store burned down with something new opening up in its place. I never went back to that park alone, and there was no reason to anymore anyway. I have since been diagnosed with agoraphobia, which is unrelated, but I don't know what the tapes were, or why the hell he charged so much, but I don't think I want to either. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.